Dr. Kahneman, very nice of you to join us today. And before we get into the implications of your work for people who think they can do well in the stock market by their own genius, please recount the story of your first lesson in irrationality in Paris, 1941, early 42, German occupied, you're Jewish, you wear the Star of David. Tell us what happened as a young child.
Well, I was a 7-year-old boy, and there was a curfew for Jews, and indeed I had my sweater with the Star of David on it. And I stayed too long with a friend, and I was past the curfew time. And so I put my sweater upside down, and I walked home. And very close to home, I still remember the place. It's in Neuilly, near, it's a suburb of Paris. I saw a German soldier walking towards me, and he was wearing the black uniform, and black uniforms meant a lot. I mean, those were the SS. They were the worst of the worst. And so I knew that one should be afraid of them. And then he beckoned me, he called me, and I went up to him, and he picked me up. And I remember very vividly that, being terrified that he would see inside my sweater that I was wearing the Star of David. And then he hugged me, and he put me down, and he took out his wallet, and he showed me a picture of a little boy, and he gave me some money. So that was a father, and I reminded him of his son. And I remember sort of the astonishment, the complexity of it. I was a 7-year-old boy, but that was telling you that life was very complicated if killers could behave like that.
The rest of your story, as you've said, yours had a relatively benign outcome, but moving in France and how your father was arrested and then sprung out.
Well, my father was the chief of chemical research in a large French concern. In fact, it was part of L'Oréal, and which is very well known these days. And he was protected during the war to the extent possible. He was picked up and sent to Drancy, the famous place where Jews were sent, and ultimately from where very few people returned. But he was released, and it turned out that was through the intervention of a man named Schweller. Very complicated story. I don't remember the detail. I never knew the detail, but it involved some German officer and a woman who was in love with him and all sorts of things. But many years later, I learned that Schweller, whose daughter is famous, she is the richest person in France, actually. Schweller had been the main funder of the fascists in France before the war, and it was a virulently anti-Semitic movement. But he liked my father, and he protected us to the extent he could. We got packages of food from them throughout the war, even after my father died.
Amazing. So you learned at an early age that the human mind is not a simple thing.
Definitely.
Now, before we get to the implications for investing, one of your early tasks was in Israel, where you were born, what became Israel, was to try to pick out people who were good officer material for the Army. And what did you learn from that process?
Well, I learned a lot from that process. It was very influential in the work I did later. We would give field tests to people who wanted to be officers. They were candidates for officer training. And there were field tests, and where people would be given a task, a difficult task, a physical task, like pick up a log and use it to pass over an obstacle. And we would watch them in action. We're in groups of 8. And the stunning thing is, when you watch a thing like that, you see personalities. It's just very, very convincing. And so we saw them in action. There's a feeling you get a real direct access to how good the person is as a leader, each one of them. There were some leaders and some wimps and some you see all characters. But then, about once a month, we would have the Friday of statistics. I mean, that was the last day of the week, and they would come and tell us how well we were doing in predicting success in officer training. And the fact was, consistently, we were not doing anything. I mean, we were just guessing. What we were seeing had nothing to do with reality. But the striking thing, and which influenced my work a lot, is that even after you're told statistically that it's nothing, that you can't do this, you cannot predict how well they'll do. The next Sunday, there is a batch of people, you take them to the obstacle course, you watch them, and you see them just as clearly as ever. So this disconnect between knowing that there is something you can't do and feeling that you personally can do it, that's been with me all my life, and I think there is a lot of it on Wall Street.
Well, that gets to, you won a Nobel Prize fathoming the human mind. You've made the point that perhaps it's because there's so many smart people in finance that individual stock pickers, managers cannot consistently beat the market.
Well, it's not a point I made. The point, I'm not a finance expert, so,
Well, clearly they're not either.
Yeah. Well, I mean, nobody, when it comes to stock picking, perhaps nobody is. That certainly was Malkiel's point. So yes. I was, I'm a consumer of this stuff. What I find very interesting is that although everybody, I think, recognizes that in principle you can't do this, because if you could pick stocks very well, then other people would also be picking those stocks, so the advantage would be gone. So everybody realizes that in principle it's impossible, but everybody personally thinks they can do it.
Like your officers.
Yeah, and that's exactly like the officer's story. That I find fascinating. I call it an illusion of skill. You know that it's wrong, but you feel something else.
And why does that persist?
Well, it persists because you get the immediate feeling of that you understand something. That is much more compelling than the knowledge of statistics that tell you that you don't know anything. And that again is the officer's story. But it's writ large that you really see it at work in many domains, in the financial domain, where people feel that they can do things that in fact we know and they should know they can't do.
Now, in one sense, that would lead an investor to throw up his or her hands in despair. Does that mean they should just go to index funds? But you make the point, no, you just don't be passive. Well,
I actually am a believer in index funds. I think all behavioral economists say if you don't have very specific information, which in some sense you're not allowed to have, you'd better not kid yourself that you can pick individual stocks. There are many niches in finance. I mean, this is not a general conclusion about finance, because obviously there are many domains in finance where there is information that you can pick up quite legally and that will enable you to do better than other people. But that doesn't seem to be true, in the stock market proper.
You made the point then, when it comes to investing, that instead of asking how much do I need to make or should make or can make, your first question you should ask yourself, how much can I lose?
Yeah, I think one of the major results of, the psychology of decision making is that people's attitudes and feelings about losses and gains are really not symmetric. So we really feel more pain when we lose $10,000 than we feel pleasure when we get $10,000. And that asymmetry is just a fact of life. Now, it affects professionals much less than individuals, because professionals play a repeated game. So, you win a few, you lose a few. Once you have that attitude, you're okay. Or you're better off. But individual investors feel losses very keenly, and they should be aware of that. And what happens is, if you're not aware of that, when things go bad, you'll want to change what you're doing, and that's the disaster in investing. I think that here it's quite obvious that loss aversion can kill you.
Well, Burton Malkiel, whom you referred to a few minutes ago, makes the point, if you are consistent, you will do fine. The market will rescue you. Emotions are your enemy.
Emotions are indeed your enemy. I mean, the worst thing that can happen to you, of course, is to bail out of, to make a decision and then not stick with it, so that you bail out when things go badly, so that you sell low and you buy high. That is not a recipe for doing very well in the stock market or anywhere.
Whipsawed. What can financial advisors then do for people?
Well, I think they have a lot of expertise that is relevant, but we should know what they can do and what they can't do. I think they know about taxes much better than than most other people do. I think they have some, and taxes are a very big deal. They know about fees much better than other people do. So I think they're worth going to. There's a lot that they know that you can use, but when they start telling you that I've heard this wonderful thing about this stock, you might seriously consider another financial advisor. Now,
I think you make a distinction too between, these are my words, not yours, between money, serious money, such as for retirement, and what you might call mad money, or money that you can suffer a loss and not destroy your lifestyle.
Well, that would be, I was consulting and still am with a financial firm, Guggenheim Partners, and there it's a doctrine now. When you deal with very wealthy investors, the question is, of your wealth, how much are you willing to put at risk? How much are you willing to lose, in fact? Because this is money you should be prepared to lose. And how much do you really want to protect? Now, this is something that people find very natural, that distinction. And then they find it very natural to be quite conservative with the amount they want to protect, and to be fairly bold with the amount they're willing to lose. It's not optimal for wealth maximization. And in a way, it's completely artificial, because ultimately, it's their wealth. It's one pocket. But psychologically, people have mental accounts, and they want to feel safe on one big sum, and they're willing to gamble on another.
You make the point that if somebody finds a way to do well, it attracts imitators. We see it with hedge funds, equity funds. We did a story a year ago on Mitt Romney. What he did at Bain in the early years was unique, eating their own cooking. They just didn't take over a company, they went in and managed the company. Others picked up on that, so their advantage was lost. Is that true of most investing strategies?
Well, I mean, it is almost bound to be true of investing strategies. I mean, one of the things that are very remarkable, actually, about your program, about this program, is the number of optimists there are who come and tell you a way to get rich. They should be getting rich. They shouldn't be telling other people.
Is there anything to the idea of people who've done well over time, and you make the point 5 years is not a good measure, that when a smart manager has a cold hand, is that the time to go in?
Well, when you talk to managers, well, in the first place, 5 years is really nothing. I mean, people who go by the record of the 5 years just don't understand statistics. They don't know how many funds there are. There are just so many things out there that by chance alone you're getting to get 5 good years. That tells you essentially nothing. There are some seriously long streaks, so no one that I know in behavioral economics, and this is not in behavioral finance, this is not my field, I'm not a financial expert, but nobody is willing to swear that there aren't some people who have some advantage, but certainly most of the people out there who are dealing with stocks and making decisions, they're no better than chance. They're throwing darts, and they don't know it.
And that's because the market, in the sense, is efficient?
Well, it's efficient in that sense. It's not efficient necessarily in the sense that it predicts the future, but it's efficient in the weak sense in that you can't do better than it.
Reminds me of a story of a money manager in Connecticut who years ago would say you should do investing the way you should play tennis. He said, get over the fact that you're not going to play as a player in Wimbledon. Focus on just getting the ball over the net. Don't try to be fancy, just get the ball over the net. He said investing should be the same thing. Take the narrow view.
I mean, it's obviously, again, you know, if you have money to gamble and if you feel secure enough in what you're going to have at the end of the day, then you can play. And playing is enjoyable. And that should count for something. I mean, what should count for something is emotion. You know, that's how we live. So you want to live a life that you enjoy, you want to feel secure, you want to sleep well at night, you don't want to feel regret. So my main advice to investors is know yourself in terms of what you could regret. Because what you might regret, if you're regret prone, there are certain things you just shouldn't do.
The implications of your work on economics, where overlooking human nature, they considered us rational, whatever that means. What are the implications of your work, your findings, in terms of economic modeling?
Well, you know, this is a complicated story, and again, one in which I'm out of my expertise. I mean, I'm a psychologist, so I don't do economic modeling. You know, I hear about it, but I don't do it.
You're saving your time.
Well, you know, I'm doing what I know how to do, mostly, but there has been modeling, and I think the one area of progress is behavioral finance. I mean, otherwise, you know, behavioral economics is widely recognized as it's important in microeconomics, it's important in some policy, but, you know, we're not using behavioral economics successfully to predict what the market will do. You know, this hasn't happened yet and may never happen. But there are, in behavioral finance, certainly where, you know, the fate of the decision-making of individuals interact with those of organization. There is a lot that we know, and a lot of successful modeling, I think.
But in terms of the economy as a whole, that's beyond.
It hasn't happened yet. You know, I'm not an expert, but clearly it hasn't happened yet.
Your findings, what implications does it have for economic policy making? Is it,
well,
again, is it a fool's game to think if we do this, we get Y, may not get Y, do X?
Well, I think that in a way the implications are largely negative. I'll give you an example. I mean, it's clear that in economic theory, there was the assumption that institutions act like rational agents. Well, institutions are not agents. They have executives in them. So, you know, when that's the famous saying of Alan Greenspan that his framework was wrong. What this framework had been was that banks can be trusted to protect themselves. Well, banks are run by executives, and executives protect themselves. And that does not always mean that banks are going to behave rationally. So that there, this is standard economics, the agency problem and the difficulty of aligning incentives. But behavioral economics is right there and can be helpful in figuring out what are the true incentives and what kinds of mistakes people are most likely to make.
So as you've pointed out in investing, 5 years is not a good period.
No.
In judging the effectiveness of a CEO, a short period of time is highly misleading, can be highly misleading.
I mean, you know, typically we find it very difficult to separate, you know, to separate our impression of the CEO from our impression of how well the firm is doing. And, you know, so the same behavior exactly will look firm in one context and stubborn in another. And there's nothing we can do about that. This is really the way the mind works. But we ought to be aware of it. And we ought to be aware of the fact that hindsight is very important and that what we call the halo effect, forming a general impression. That's very important, plays a big role.
Now you make the point in your work that we have really two parts of the mind in essence. The fast, visceral one helps us survive, and the more rational one. Can you briefly describe that?
Well, yes. I mean, we have machinery in, I call them system 1 and system 2, or fast thinking and slow thinking, but it's really a way of pointing out that we, just in the way that we perceive the world, we don't have to decide. I don't have to decide to see you. I see you as I see you. You see me. That happens to us. And many ideas happen to us. We have intuitions, we have feelings, we have emotions. All of that happens. We don't decide to do it. We don't control it. Then there are periods where we reason, where we think more slowly, more deliberately. And then, and that's critical, we think we reason more than we actually do. That is, a lot of what we think is thinking is actually finding justifications and rationalizations for things of fast thinking tells us what to do. So it's that part that is really the dangerous part. We don't know our own minds. We think, each of us, that we're much more rational than we are. And we think that we make our decisions because we have good reasons to make them, even when it's the other way around. We believe in the reasons because we've already made the decision.
Can you give a couple of examples that have hit you over the years of people confusing fast thinking and what you call slow, deliberate thinking?
Well, there is one really remarkable thing, and everybody is quite aware of it. Why does nobody ever change their mind on political issues? You've got people talking to each other all the time and exchanging arguments. And both sides on any argument feel that their arguments are completely compelling and should lead the other side to yield. And they don't. And what that really tells you is that neither side believes what they believe because of the arguments that they raise. They believe in the arguments because they hold those beliefs. It really goes the other way around. And, we find that everywhere. In many, many places. It's not universal. I mean, when I decide whether to take a taxi or go by subway, I don't have deep feelings about it. I make a rational calculation of cost and time and so on. But many other decisions are really driven by emotions, and they're driven by impressions that we have no control over.
So when you do get political decisions made, a new consensus emerges, it's more from emotion than from somebody saying, aha, I'm reconsidering my position because of 1, 2, 3, 4.
It's much more emotion than, there are some people who are convinced by facts. And, at the margin, we pretend to be rational when we argue, and that is a good pretense to maintain. I mean, and sometimes we reach each other, but much less than we think we will.
Getting back on stock picking, there is a place for Graham Dodd in the world?
I mean, is there a right way of doing things? Well, my guess is the following. There must be there are experts. Everybody talks about Warren Buffett, and so he comes up whenever I have a conversation about this. But Warren Buffett is very, very clever, and there are many things that he can do. And in addition, beyond a certain point, he starts moving markets, so that he is
self-fulfilling.
He is self-fulfilling, and one has to be very lucky to get that far. But beyond that point, the fact that you keep on being successful is less impressive in terms of nobody can say, well, I'm going to be successful by doing the kind of thing that Warren Buffett does. I think many, many people have tried, and there aren't many Warren Buffetts.
It's like the green thumb in the garden.
Yeah.
And in terms of then closing on a career, a lot of smart people go into finance. And what the implications of what you found seem to be, you're not going to get a huge advantage very long. You should go perhaps in an area where you don't have those small incremental gains. You can really make a, use a Chinese phrase, great leap forward.
Well, you know, the odd thing is there is a very big industry out there, and it's possibly less helpful than it pretends to be, but many people believe in it. And a lot of it is self-fulfilling. And so, you know, I wouldn't advise people not to go into finance because, you know, people in finance, by and large, are doing way better than people in many other places. So I wouldn't. I would just say the reality is that you have a lot of people who think they have very smart ideas, and they're getting paid for thinking that. Not necessarily for having smart ideas, but they're being paid for, you know, for having ideas that convince other people. And so some of it is an illusion. And what is interesting, I think, it's an honest illusion. I mean, I absolutely do not have that theory that, you know, that people are devious about this. People deceive themselves. And it's the people who deceive themselves the best who have the best opportunity to mislead others quite innocently. That's sort of my view about a lot of what happens.
In closing, on going back to your experience in trying to pick officers or people who would make successful officers, have you concluded there's no systemic way to do it?
Well, no. I mean, that would be rash. There are certainly some people who do better than others.
Or is it more just seeing who you know is not going to be successful?
I mean, there are people who clearly, that is a big help, knowing who's not going to be successful, going by past performance. The main thing is the people that you think are going to do very well, on average, are going to do less well than you think. That's a fact that you have to accept. So you do the best you can, and it's not that there's nothing we can do. We know something about people, so we have a chance to pick some people. We certainly have a chance to reject those who won't do well. And we have a chance to pick some people who have a good chance, you know, an opportunity to do well. By and large, you know, the people that we think the most of statistically will disappoint us. This is a fact of life.
And I guess one prime example in the U.S. is, we were discussing earlier, Hyman Rickover created the nuclear submarine fleet in the U.S. against formidable odds. And in some ways, he was not a good commander of men and ships, but he did amazing things for the Navy.
Well, that's what happens is that occasional fit between the characteristics of an individual and the characteristics of the situation, and that was his story, I think. He was ideally fitted to force an idea. He was stubborn, he was opinionated. He was also very smart, and in a way that people could pick out that he was smart. And so, and he knew things that other people didn't. And that enabled him to do things that other people couldn't have done. You wouldn't have guessed that. It would have been very bad if he had been excluded at an early stage. In a way, you know, if the system had been sensible, it would have excluded him. And that would have been a great pity.
I guess you see that in business. Steve Jobs' biography.
Absolutely.
A very difficult personality and some early setbacks, but he emerged as a formidable leader.
Absolutely. And, you know, and anybody who thinks that they can duplicate what he did, most of the people who think that they can duplicate or even come close will never succeed. You know, there was an element of luck, and there was, and there was a very large element of unique personality.
Doctor, thank you. And the book is Thinking, Fast and Slow. Well worth a read. Thank you.
Thank you very much.